Good morning. We continue today to read from Exodus chapter 2, and we continue to explore the story of Moses. So reading from verse 11. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labour. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you our ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now, a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water to fill the troughs to water the flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue, and he watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" And they answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" Reuel asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, in our second part of chapter 2, we meet Moses now an adult. He's still living in Pharaoh's household, but he understands that his background is very different from those around him. He understands that he's not in the midst of his own people. He's living as a stranger in the ruling house at that time, maybe feeling very keenly his status as an outsider, maybe having a real sense that he didn't belong there. And so we read that he went out to where his own people were. And what happens next is a defining moment in the life of Moses, because whilst watching his kinsman at work, he killed an Egyptian who was mistreating one of the Hebrew servants. In that instant, everything changed for Moses. Because Pharaoh heard of his actions, he wanted Moses dead. He tried to kill him. And so Moses literally had to flee for his life. And we read that Moses fled to Midian. Yet again, he became a dweller amongst people who weren't of his own kind. Yet again, he became an alien in a strange land. We read that Moses rested beside a well in Midian when he met with a group of 7 sisters who were caring for their father's flock. Now these sisters, these shepherdesses, were the daughters of a priest. And whilst they were trying to water their flock, a group of shepherds came along and drove them away. Moses, once again, acted to support those in need, those who were threatened. He stood up for them. He came to their rescue and watered their flocks for them. It seems to me that at this stage in his life, Moses must have had a really strong sense of justice, that he must have felt a need to stand up for those who were being oppressed, those who weren't being treated as they should be. And his response to that wasn't just sympathy, but it was very practical. He came to the rescue of these sisters in need. We know that maybe he didn't always make the wisest of decisions in killing the Egyptian in his previous existence. He was driven out, he was threatened by death, and yet still this man of action responded to young women in need. As we read on through Exodus, it becomes clear that God had a role prepared for Moses, an enormous leadership role in taking God's people out of exile, out of slavery, through some immensely challenging experiences. But not yet. Not yet. First, there came a time of waiting, a time perhaps when Moses had to grow and mature, had to gain life experiences which would prepare him for the task ahead. He had to come to have some supporters, some people that he could look up to, that he could respect, that he could take advice from. But let's get back to our passage. We read that as a result of this encounter with 7 sisters, Moses is welcomed into their family home. Indeed, he marries one of the sisters named Zipporah, and together they have a son, whom Moses names Gershon, a reminder for Moses himself that he is a stranger there. Moses continues to live in a state of exile, far from his roots, far from his family, far from his home. But he forges a new life as a refugee, but a refugee who is to become a leader of his people and act on God's behalf. I think it's true to say that Moses' life took many an unexpected turn, and in each step of that journey we see that God was preparing the way. He was sending people who would help him, people who would influence him, people who would be active in his maturing and preparing for the role ahead. In this instance, God provided Moses not just with a family, with a wife and a son, but with an extended family. His father-in-law, Reuel, also called Jethro in other parts of the Bible, was a priest. He was a man who was comfortable in a leadership role. He was a man who I suspect that Moses could find a wise counsellor, a confidant, perhaps something of a role model for his own future life. As we read on through the book of Exodus, we discover that Moses will spend a number of years with Jethro and his family in Midian, living in harmony, discovering how to live in the land, of the land, and with the land. At the same time, we hear that the people left behind were groaning in their slavery. They were having a terrible time, and they were calling out to God to save them. And God heard their calls. God heard their moaning as prayers, and he responded. He remembered his covenant promises that we heard about in the book of Genesis, promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. God, it tells us, felt the people's pain, and he was concerned for them. And Moses goes on to play an immense part in God's response to their cries. But that's a story for someone other than me to share with you. What I would like to do today is finish by reminding ourselves that when the days look dark, when we find ourselves in unexpected situations, then God will listen to our prayers. God will find a solution. But we have to remember that those solutions, as for Moses and his people, may take a time to reveal themselves. There may be dark days just as Moses experienced. There may be times when, just as the slaves in Egypt were, we call out to God and ask for his help. We call out to God and trust his promises. But we have to wait. We have to wait, secure in the knowledge that God hasn't abandoned us and that he will send someone to be alongside us, to listen, to support, to offer wise counsel. So may I wish that this day we can all feel God close by. We can all know ourselves to be precious in God's sight. And when we feel able, may we see and count our blessings, even as we wait for God's direction for the future and his response to our prayers.